Sometimes history is written through great speeches and revolutions, but sometimes history is written through a single step. In 1956, inside the commissary of MGM Studios, one step would quietly challenge everything Hollywood had accepted as normal. Louis Armstrong was the most famous jazz musician in the world that year. His trumpet was the voice of a generation. His smile was a symbol of hope. He had risen from the muddy streets of New Orleans, overcome poverty and obstacles that would have broken most people. Now he was performing in one of Hollywood's biggest productions, sharing the screen with Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, and Grace Kelly. But in the commissary of that same studio, Louis still sat at the corner table, alone, with his band, but still separate. Celeste Holm, the Oscar-winning actress, watched this scene unfold day after day. She watched Louis perform brilliantly during filming. Then she watched him retreat to that corner table when the cameras stopped. One day, Celeste picked up her tray and began walking toward Louis Armstrong's table. Bing Crosby raised his eyebrows. Frank Sinatra lowered his cigarette. Grace Kelly smiled softly. And Louis Armstrong, for the first time on a Hollywood set, felt truly seen. But to understand why that single step meant so much, we need to go back to where Louis Armstrong's journey began. If you love stories about courage, dignity, and quiet moments that change the world, subscribe to this channel. This is a story you will not want to miss. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. 1901, August 4th, New Orleans, Louisiana. In a neighborhood so poor and neglected it barely had a name, a baby boy was born who would one day change the sound of music forever. They called the area Bacco Town, and it was one of the roughest, most dangerous places in America at that time. The streets were unpaved and often flooded with muddy water. The houses leaned against each other as if too tired to stand alone. And into this world of desperate poverty came Louis Armstrong, born to Willie and Mary Ann Armstrong. His father Willie abandoned the family almost immediately after Louis was born, leaving Mary Ann to raise her children alone, in circumstances that would have defeated most people. Mary Ann was barely more than a teenager herself, struggling to survive in a society that offered few opportunities for a young black woman without resources or connections. She worked long hours at any job she could find, leaving young Louis in the care of his grandmother much of the time. Young Louis knew hunger intimately. He knew the feeling of going to sleep with an empty stomach, wondering if there would be food the next day. He knew the shame of wearing clothes patched together from scraps because his family could not afford new ones. By the time he was 7 years old, he was already working to help support the family. He sold newspapers on street corners before the sun came up, shouting headlines into the early morning darkness. He delivered coal to homes and businesses, carrying heavy buckets through the streets until his small arms ached. He sang on street corners with other poor children, harmonizing for whatever pennies strangers might toss their way. But even in that desperate poverty, something remarkable was growing inside the boy. He found music. The streets of New Orleans were alive with sound even in the poorest neighborhoods. Brass bands marching through for funerals and celebrations. Jazz spilling from dance halls and honky-tonks. The rhythm of a city that seemed to breathe music with every heartbeat. Young Louis absorbed it all like a sponge, dreaming of someday making those beautiful sounds himself. He did not know yet that music would become his salvation, his voice, his ticket out of poverty. But the seeds were being planted. What do you think kept Louis going during those incredibly difficult years? Let us know in the comments. In 1912, something happened that could have destroyed Louis Armstrong's life forever. On New Year's Eve, the streets of New Orleans were alive with celebration. People fired guns into the air, a dangerous but common tradition in that era. 11-year-old Louis, caught up in the excitement, found a pistol and fired it skyward. Within minutes, police arrived. The young boy was arrested and sent to the colored waifs' home for boys, a reform school for black children. His mother wept. His grandmother prayed, and Louis, just a child, found himself locked behind. institutional walls separated from everyone he loved. But what was meant as punishment became the greatest turning point of his life. The waif's home had something Louis had never encountered before, a brass band. The band director was a man named Peter Davis, stern and disciplined, but with a genuine passion for teaching music to the boys in his care. Louis begged to join the band. He volunteered for extra chores just to earn time near the instruments. At first, Davis assigned Louis to the tambourine, then the drums, then the bugle, and finally, after Louis had proven his dedication, a cornet was placed in his young hands. The moment Louis put that instrument to his lips, something magical happened. It was as if the cornet had been waiting for him his entire life. The music that had lived inside him all those years finally had a voice. Within months, Louis was the best player in the entire band. Within a year, he was leading it, directing the other boys with a natural authority that impressed even the strict Peter Davis. That reform school meant to punish Louis for a moment of youthful foolishness, instead gave him the gift that would define his entire existence. When Louis was released in 1914, he returned to the streets of New Orleans, but now he had a purpose. Music became his path forward, his escape from poverty, his salvation when nothing else could save him. He played anywhere that would have him. Honky-tonks, dance halls, riverboats cruising up and down the mighty Mississippi, jazz clubs that were flourishing throughout the city. His talent was undeniable, a gift that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human ability. In 1918, Louis got his first major break when King Oliver chose him as his replacement in Kid Ory's band. 4 years later, King Oliver invited Louis to join him in Chicago. Louis packed his single suitcase and boarded a train heading north. He was 21 years old, carrying nothing but his cornet and his dreams. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really helps us bring more stories like this to you. Chicago in the 1920s was alive with jazz. Louis arrived and within months revolutionized how music was played. His recordings with the Hot 5 and Hot 7 became some of the most important music in American history. He bent notes in ways that seemed impossible, created melodies that seemed divine. By the 1930s, Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous entertainers in the world. His records sold millions of copies across America and Europe. His concerts drew enormous crowds of adoring fans from all walks of life. His face and his distinctive smile were recognized everywhere he went. But fame did not protect him from the painful realities of being a black man in mid-century America. He could fill concert halls with audiences of every background, but he often could not eat in the restaurants near those venues. He could perform for presidents and royalty, but he frequently could not stay in the hotels where his white colleagues were welcomed. There were countless nights when Louis entered venues through the back door, through service entrances meant for deliveries and staff. He would perform brilliantly for hours, giving everything he had to audiences that included some of the most powerful people in America. He would receive standing ovations that shook the rafters. And then he would have to leave through that same back door, unable to mingle with the white patrons who had just cheered his genius. He could not eat in their dining rooms. He could not use their facilities. The contradiction was constant, relentless, and painful beyond measure. Being celebrated and degraded simultaneously was a wound that never fully healed, no matter how famous he became or how many records he sold. Yet Louis Armstrong never let bitterness consume his spirit. He made a choice, again and again, to respond to hatred with love, to meet discrimination with dignity, to choose joy over despair and connection over isolation. His famous smile was not naivety or ignorance. It was a deliberate choice, a form of resistance against a world that wanted to diminish him and make him feel small. Louis refused to be diminished. He refused to let anyone steal his joy. He would let his music speak louder than any insult, any closed door, any segregated lunch counter. That smile became his armor and his weapon, proof that nothing could break his spirit. Have you ever witnessed someone face unfair treatment with dignity? Share your experience in the comments. By the 1940s, Hollywood had recognized what the music world already knew. Louis Armstrong was a star. He began appearing in films, bringing his magnetic presence to the screen. In 1956 came his biggest opportunity. He was cast in High Society, a musical comedy starring Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, and Grace Kelly. Louis would perform Now You Has Jazz alongside Bing Crosby, a number celebrating the history of jazz. For Louis, this was recognition at the highest level of entertainment. He arrived at MGM Studios with his band, ready to create something memorable. But the MGM lot operated by rules nobody spoke about, but everybody understood. There was an invisible wall. During filming, everyone worked together, but when the cameras stopped, when lunch was called, that invisible wall became visible. The commissary was where stars gathered. Bing Crosby sat at the table reserved for leads. Frank Sinatra held court at another. Grace Kelly took her meals in a quiet corner. Louis Armstrong and his band had their meals in a separate area, not because anyone explicitly told them to sit apart, but because that was how things were done. It was understood. Louis never complained. He simply did what he had always done. He smiled, played brilliantly, and waited for things to change. But someone was watching. Celeste Holm had won the Academy Award in 1947 for Gentleman's Agreement, a film about prejudice. She was known for her principles. She believed art should reflect the best of human values. On the high society set, Celeste watched Louis during musical numbers, marveling at his extraordinary talent. When he performed Now You Has Jazz, even jaded crew members stopped to listen, but Celeste also watched what happened when the music stopped. She noticed how Louis retreated to the corner. She noticed how the invisible wall materialized around him. Here was an artist of immense stature sitting alone while lesser talents enjoyed full privileges. It troubled her deeply. For several days, Celeste observed without acting. She understood that challenging unwritten rules had consequences, but she also understood that silence was a choice, that accepting things as they were was participation in injustice. One morning, Celeste made her decision. When lunch was called, she picked up her tray from the serving line and began walking. But she did not walk toward where other white performers sat. She walked directly toward Louis Armstrong's table. The commissary seemed to grow quiet as Celeste crossed the room. Her heels clicked against the floor. Her destination was unmistakable. Louis looked up as she approached. Surprise first, then something like concern. Then, as Celeste sat down across from him, something else appeared in his eyes. Recognition. Gratitude. The acknowledgement of being truly seen. "May I join you?" Celeste asked. Louis smiled that famous smile, but something was different now. Something more genuine than the public smile he showed to cameras. "The pleasure is mine," Louis replied. What happened next was subtle but significant. The commissary did not transform overnight. But something shifted. The next day, one musician from Louis's band sat closer to the main dining area. No one objected. Days later, a crew member asked to join them for coffee. Louis welcomed him warmly. Grace Kelly began greeting Louis personally whenever she saw him. She would stop by his table during breaks, listen to his stories about jazz. Frank Sinatra nodded at Louis one afternoon in a way that seemed more respectful than before. Bing Crosby began spending more time with Louis during rehearsals. Their on-screen chemistry deepened as their off-screen rapport grew. Over remaining weeks of production, Celeste and Louis shared many meals together. They talked about music and film, about the contradictions of fame. Louis told stories from his remarkable life, the streets of New Orleans, the reform school, the riverboats, the rise to stardom. Celeste listened with genuine interest, but they also talked about harder things. The doors that remained closed no matter how famous Louis became. The hotels that rejected his reservation. The restaurants where he could perform but not eat. Louis spoke without bitterness, but also without pretending it did not hurt. Celeste shared her own experiences. Making Gentleman's Agreement had opened her eyes to prejudice she had not previously understood. She believed change happened through accumulated small acts of courage. What began as a simple act of solidarity became a genuine and lasting friendship. Celeste and Louis discovered they shared a love not just of performance, but of the deeper principles behind it. Both believed that art at its best could elevate humanity and bridge the divides that separated people from one another. Louis introduced Celeste to the rich history of jazz, explaining the theory and tradition behind the music that had shaped his entire life. She developed a deeper appreciation for the art form and for the extraordinary community that had created and sustained it against tremendous obstacles over the decades. High society wrapped after several weeks of intense filming. The movie became a commercial and critical success, introducing Louis Armstrong to millions of moviegoers who had never seen him perform on screen before. The Now You Has Jazz number became one of the most celebrated highlights of the entire film. showcasing Louis at his most charismatic and brilliant best. The friendship continued long after cameras stopped rolling. They attended each other's performances when schedules allowed. They exchanged letters over the years or a year. In interviews, Celeste often mentioned Louis as one of the most remarkable people she had ever met. She spoke about his talent, but more importantly about his character, his generosity despite everything he had endured, his refusal to let bitterness poison his art. Louis remembered Celeste as someone who had treated him with simple human dignity when such treatment was not guaranteed. To be seen as a full human being rather than a category. To be valued for who he was rather than tolerated despite it. These were gifts Louis never took for granted. The moment in the MGM commissary was not a turning point in the civil rights movement. It did not make headlines or inspire legislation. It was a small moment in a large and complex story. But small moments accumulate. Each time someone refuses to accept an unjust status quo, the ground shifts slightly. Each time someone chooses connection over separation, courage over conformity, the path becomes easier for those who will follow. History is made not only by grand gestures, but by countless small acts of decency that most people never hear about. Louis Armstrong continued breaking barriers through his art and his presence until his passing in 1971. He became an unofficial ambassador for American music around the world, beloved on every continent, welcomed by kings and commoners alike. His recordings remain essential, listening for anyone who wants to understand how popular music developed in the 20th century. His influence can be heard in virtually every genre that followed, and his spirit, that unbreakable optimism in the face of injustice, continues to inspire generations who never had the privilege of seeing him perform. Celeste Holm continued her distinguished career in film, television, and theater for decades after high society. She remained committed to the principles she had demonstrated that day in the commissary, using her platform to advocate for causes she believed in and refusing to stay silent when silence would have been easier. She passed away in 2012 at the age of 95, remembered not just for her considerable talent, but for her integrity and her courage. Today, more than 6 decades later, their story reminds us that change often happens through quiet acts of decency. Not through speeches, but through gestures. Celeste did not end segregation by sitting at Louis's table, but she demonstrated that invisible walls can be crossed by anyone willing to take a step. Sometimes courage looks like picking up a lunch tray and walking in a different direction than expected. And Louis Armstrong, the boy who came from nothing, who transformed American music, who smiled in the face of indignities that would have broken lesser spirits, found in that simple moment something valuable. He found recognition. He found friendship. He found confirmation that his belief in human goodness was not misplaced. What a wonderful world it can be when people choose to see each other fully and take that single step that changes everything. Thank you for watching. If this moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of a single step.